Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and as you can see, I'm outdoors. I'm visiting my in laws, and it's in Ohio. And I'm just going to take a few moments to answer a query which came through the comments. And it was a question about how to theorize. And the question was a little more specific about how to theorize about Muslim identities and things like that. And I briefly answered it in the comments, but I thought I should add a little bit to it. So first of all, theorizing is when you are trying to construct some new concepts to answer some questions about literary studies or about questions of culture. Now, of course, no video can explain how to theorize, right? You don't just sit and come up with a concept. You have to know where the conversation is in any given field to know where you are entering the conversation. And then come up with your own concepts or your own ways of explaining or theorizing about certain things in the world. So the first prerequisite then, of course, is knowing where the debates are in any given situation. For example, as the person who posed the question asked about Islam and Muslims and the question of terrorism. So if you want to theorize about that, you have to read first what is being said. Are there people who are essentializing Muslim identity? Are there people who are challenging that essentialization? So read the works by, let's say, American conservatives, like people like Daniel Pipes, right, and others. And then go and read responses by Edward Said, by people like Hamid Dabashi, me, myself, right? How have we responded to it? And then see where you want to come in and theorize your own particular understanding of Muslim identity. If you want somewhat, good enough discussion of that, please check out my book on ISIS, which came out in 2019, in which I build on the previous knowledge and try to articulate my own point of view. But anytime you're thinking of theorizing, it's part philosophy, right? Part thinking, part understanding the concepts. And you cannot theorize out of a vacuum, right? You have to know where the conversation is. You have to know where the debates are. And that cannot be done without extensive reading and deep understanding. So please keep that in mind. Now, this doesn't apply to what people call the grounded theory. In grounded theory, the role is reverse. Right? The researcher doesn't go in with pre-designated theoretical way of looking at things. The researcher goes into qualitative research, interviews people, does contextual observations, takes the notes, and then out of those notes, out of what people say, emerges the theory. Right? That's grounded theory. That's completely different from what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is theorizing within the context of literary studies and maybe cultural studies. So keep that in mind. Now the question was, how do we theorize? So, of course, we learn. What do we learn? We learn the philosophical debates around the questions of human identity, questions of human subjectivity, right? Text, what is a text? How have people talked about it? What is writing itself? What is literature itself? After we have gathered deep knowledge about all these aspects of what constitutes literary studies, we might reach a point where we might be able to theorize. Right? But that theorization will always be with reference to what has already been produced and what is lacking in it. Right? So if you are interested in writing about your own cultural domain, there's nothing wrong with it. But then know your own cultural debates. right? Know your own cultural history. For example, if you live in Pakistan or in any other Islamic country and you want to theorize things in the Islamic way, there is nothing wrong with it. But know the history of philosophical debates within the Islamic tradition. You cannot do that. You cannot theorize without a deep immersion into the history of Islamic philosophy. You have to know, your Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, and so many other people whose names even I don't know, right? And then that will give you a history of philosophy that came through the Islamic traditions. Where is it where the Greeks come in? How do they incorporate those within not just their philosophical thinking, but also in their theological thinking? All of those things you will have to understand clearly and deeply before you attempt to theorize. The purpose of theory isn't just to give some esoteric vocabularies to everyday things. The purpose of theory is to give a structure, a way of looking at things, a way of looking at texts, right? So when we theorize, what we are doing is we are coming up with concepts that encapsulate larger things that are happening in the world. That's why for a lot of people, like for Deleuze and even for Freire, theory is not separate from praxis. It's actually, in so many cases, informed by the praxis. So there is no distinction that I'm being theoretical now and now I'm being an empiricist. They work hand in hand. So, to say briefly, to theorize anything, a concept or a way of looking at the world, a way of reading the text, you have to first make yourself aware, have a deeper understanding of theory in that particular field, and then building on it. Let me give you an example. So a lot of people talk about Iqbal and his philosophy of Khudi, falsafa-e Khudi, which everyone finds deeply intriguing. Now, did Iqbal just sit down and come up with it? Of course not. He read his Nietzsche, he read his other German ideologists, right? And then he scattered in his work is an idea of Khudi. What is Khudi? An idea of self, a theorization of self. What is self? What does it do? How does it come to be? How do we construct it? How do we make it free, right, of the limitations of this material life? All of that is encapsulated in that philosophy of Khudi, philosophy of self. How was Iqbal able to put it in his poetry? Because he had read extensively. If you read his dissertation, it's an intellectual engagement with the philosophies of the West and the East, right? Without that knowledge, he couldn't have just sat down and taught the falsafa of Khudi. He could have, but it might have been still not original enough, not deeply thought enough. Now, there are distinctions to be made, between philosophizing and theorizing. If you go by Deleuze and Guattari's definition of philosophy, the work of philosophy is to construct constructs, to construct concepts, right? But even that doesn't mean that you pluck these concepts out of nothingness. Those concepts are always on what they would call an immanent plane. Understanding the plane is the first step towards that. But overall, if you feel like theorizing, my advice is that, read extensively on that particular topic and then see what others have written about it. Because that would tell you where the conversation is. And then you can theorize your own way of looking at the same thing through a different conceptual modality. But that must come from that knowledge, because only then you'll be able to articulate as to why there is a need of a different kind of theorization or a different way of looking at things. So that's all. I hope this answers the question. As always, my answers are never really fully exhaustive. And as I've said so many times, videos alone cannot ever teach you the deeper things about life and about literary studies or philosophy. Reading does that. Careful reading over years is what will enable you to do that. Thank you so much. Hope you all are staying safe and taking care of each other. Continue doing so, and I will now see you next time. Until then, from Ohio Valley, peace and love.